Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Jedi, the Sith, and the Force are at the heart of the whole Star Wars universe, and the Clone Wars were no exception to this. As we all know, Jedi during the Clone Wars were heavily involved in leading the clone armies on the battlefield, and their combat prowess often proved to be a valuable asset as well. Without the Force, things might have gone much worse for the Republic. But even then, sometimes it seems like the Force isn't being used enough. There are many cases in which Jedi appear to have been able to use the Force to save lives or accomplish some task easier, and yet they didn't. In this video, we'll be going into why. Before we get into the full answer, it should be made clear why this is a question in the first place. The Force, obviously, is extremely powerful. It can be used for telekinesis, foresight, telepathy, and all manner of things. But the obvious things aren't the only benefits Force sensitives get. There are smaller or more obscure powers that can be used as well, and if fully exploited, these powers have the potential to make Force sensitives effectively unbeatable for anyone who isn't a Force sensitive themselves. First and foremost, the Force can be used to subtly enhance one's standard combat abilities. With the Force, a fighter can become slightly faster, slightly stronger, or slightly more coordinated, and the opposite effects can be imposed on one's opponents. Most people that are trained in the Force even experience a limited sense of foresight during combat, allowing them to see an enemy's moves before they even make them. These factors are what make the Jedi so deadly, and allows them to do things like parry blaster bolts. A Jedi Master with incredible strength in the Force is capable of incredible feats, as Mace Windu displayed on Dantooine for example. Other Force abilities are particularly useful for warfare. The admittedly rare art of battle meditation allows a Jedi to change the course of battles by coordinating entire armies with their minds, allowing for the seamless execution of strategies and increasing the morale and endurance of their own soldiers while crushing the morale and endurance of their enemies. Force healing is a much more common and an equally useful ability, which allows Jedi to use the Force to speed up organic regeneration in themselves and other beings. Jedi healers like Barriss Offee were employed quite frequently due to the effectiveness of this ability. You might have noticed that almost all of the abilities that we've described were effectively defensive, or at least not overtly offensive. This is not a coincidence. As their ideology might suggest, the abilities used by most Jedi are primarily defensive, useful for preserving the strength and lives of themselves and their allies. The Jedi don't use all that many outright offensive attacks, and those that they do use are almost entirely tied to telekinesis. There are offensive Force abilities which can wound, inspire terror in, electrocute, crush, or even outright drain the life from opponents. However, all of these powers are linked to the dark side and to the Sith. This again is no coincidence. The light and dark sides of the Force aren't simply analogues for good and evil, they're also not simply emotionless and emotionally charged uses of the Force. The light and dark are different methods of using the Force altogether, rooted in very different views of a person's very relation to the Force. This is part of the reason why Jedi don't seem to use the Force as much as they could during the Clone Wars. They don't really have all that many offensive powers at their disposal, and they're hesitant to use even the ones that they do have. As Yoda himself said to Luke Skywalker and Dagobah, a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge or defense, never for attack.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
But tell me why I can't.
No.
It would be more accurate to say that a Jedi doesn't actually use the Force at all. They let the Force use them. To use the light side of the Force is to clear one's mind of emotional distractions or urges, to open oneself up to the will of the Force so that they can act as an instrument of it. They act as the Force wants them to act, no more and no less. This is why a Jedi's power is usually made to manifest defensively. If we know anything about the will of the Force, it's that it generally aims toward the preservation of life, not the destruction of it. This is also why the Sith and other Darksiders seem to use the Force more often, because they're the ones actually using the Force. To use the dark side is to bend the Force to one's own will, to control the Force for one's own ends. This is why most offensive Force powers are seen as being tied to the dark side. Instead of working to preserve life, they are often used to take the easier path and destroy life of one's opponent instead, which is ultimately not what the will of the Force is seeking at all. This is also why the Sith rarely use those more defensive powers as well. That's the domain of the light, and inefficient in their view. So there's the first part of our answer. Jedi didn't use the Force as much as they seemingly could have because they don't really use the Force offensively if they can help it, and the defensive attributes of the Force aren't all that noticeable. But that doesn't really solve the issue. Even with the previously discussed material taken into account, there are occasions where Jedi fail to save people when they could have, or where they could have used the Force to stop, for example, General Grievous. There is, however, more to the matter. Anyone who's ever played Jedi Academy, Knights of the Old Republic, and even Battlefront 2 in a way will know that in games, if you spam Force powers, you'll eventually hit a sort of exhaustion barrier, where your character will run out of Force points or some similar game mechanic. And while the Force does not have a cooldown timer or a special energy level thing that needs to be taken into account, those who use the Force do have something similar as a byproduct of being living beings: exhaustion. Anyone who's ever done any sort of fighting, real or as part of a sport in real life, will readily tell you that combat is exhausting. And while Jedi were able to use the Force to stave off exhaustion, even the strongest of them couldn't eliminate it entirely, because at the end of the day, they were all living beings. Take into account the fact that the Jedi in the Clone Wars were constantly moving from battlefield to battlefield and constantly in the thick of combat, and you can see pretty clearly why exhaustion was a big issue for Jedi. And the 4 aside, we all know from experience how exhaustion affects pretty much everything you do. On top of that, there's also the fact that using the Force in the first place can lead to exhaustion as, like everything else, it's an exertion of strength, just in a different way from combat. This explains why Jedi seemingly try to conserve their Force powers in battle, or why they don't use them when seemingly they easily could. In most cases, they were either too exhausted to be able to use the strength required, or they were too exhausted to realize that the Force could come in handy for the situation they were in. There's one final important factor to be taken into account here as well: concentration. Using the Force requires a good deal of concentration, especially for the less experienced and for Jedi in general, since the use of the light side requires clarity of mind and openness to the will of the Force. For Padawans and inexperienced knights that find themselves in a situation that's out of their league, they might be unable to maintain the concentration required to effectively use the Force. The Sith, of course, knew of this concentration weakness, and as a result, agents of the Confederacy used it heavily. Dooku and the Dark Acolytes frequently employed Dun Moch against the Jedi, a Sith technique that essentially consisted of taunting their opponent into slipping to the dark side or making a mistake. Anakin Skywalker proved especially susceptible to this, as fans of the Clone Wars will doubtlessly remember. None of the Confederacy's agent was more skilled in breaking the concentration of a Jedi than General Grievous, however. The combination of his sheer speed, sheer strength, unpredictability, unorthodox tactics, and the fear he inspired in opponents was incredibly destructive to the concentration of his Jedi opponents, which is why Jedi rarely seem to use the Force against him. As it turns out, they actually can't use the Force against him. Trying to concentrate enough to use the Force even in the slightest of ways would, for most Jedi, result in a slight decrease of one's guard, which was often enough for Grievous to finish the battle. All of these factors combined, we think, sufficiently explain why Jedi seemingly didn't use their Force at opportune times during the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Do you agree with our assessment, or do you think there are holes in our argument? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And just before you go, I find that most people who like Star Wars also like history as well. And if you are one of those people, then make sure you check out my history channel called The Front. We're now doing 3 videos a week on that channel, and it's all about the niche topics of World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and pretty much any war in human history. So if you are a history buff and you want to hear my voice a little bit more on that channel, then make sure you go check it out. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.